Hi students, this is 31.4 Turning Points in World War II. In this section we're looking at major turning points that began to shift the war in the favor of the Allies. We'll start with sea and air battles. In the Pacific, after Pearl Harbor, Japan pretty much had complete control of the Pacific Ocean. The American fleet was so heavily damaged they couldn't stand up in a toe-to-toe battle. And until they get some of those battleships refloated and repaired and back in the fight, they're not going to be a match for the Japanese Pacific Fleet. Germany wanted similar dominance in the Atlantic. In the Atlantic, of course, the opposition was not the Americans, but the British Navy. And so Germany brought a variety of tactics to try to assert naval control of the Atlantic. One thing they did was the use of submarine warfare, U-boats. They targeted both military and merchant shipping. Remember, this is during the period of the Lend-Lease Act, in which the United States, under FDR, was not just selling, but sort of advance loaning war materials to the British. So any merchant ship at sea in the Atlantic, as far as the Germans saw, could be transporting war materials to Britain and therefore was a military target. By as early as 1939, U-boats had sunk over 100 ships in the Atlantic, both military and merchant. There was a big surface naval war, too, known as the Battle of the Atlantic, between the British Navy and the German Navy. Battleships at this point are bigger, tougher, carrying bigger guns. Ever since World War I, there's been this sort of arms race in naval battleships. And these big battleships go toe-to-toe in the Atlantic. Both sides get their taste of victory. The British lose the HMS Hood, but the Germans lose their biggest and newest and most powerful battleship, the Bismarck, which ensures ultimately that Britain can maintain its position as the world's most powerful navy, at least in the Atlantic. And the German dream of total Atlantic control, in the same way the Japanese control the Pacific, is ultimately lost. The biggest land battle in this section is Stalingrad. And if we want to talk about turning points in World War II, we need to really consider that Stalingrad, perhaps more than any other conflict, was a major shift in the Allies gaining the upper hand. Stalingrad is named for Joseph Stalin. It is a big, powerful industrial city in southern Soviet Union on the Volga River. For Hitler to attack it was not only a strike at Soviet industry, but also an attack on Stalin's namesake city, and would have been a huge embarrassment for him to have lost. Now, Hitler has already failed to take Moscow. To take Stalingrad would have given him a key victory in the battle against Soviet Russia. However, the Russian army is more than ready for Hitler's German troops. The German forces are far from home, which leave their supply lines opposed, so Russian counterattacks are able to weaken and disrupt the German supply lines, essentially cutting the Germans off from their supplies. And then, as it had done to Napoleon and to the German armies of World War I, the Russian winter sets in. Ultimately, the winter is so brutal and the soldiers are so poorly equipped that starvation, freezing to death, frostbite, things like this weaken the German military beyond the point of recovery. Over 100,000 killed, another nearly 100,000 captured, plus massive amounts of German military supplies and equipment are lost in their defeat at Stalingrad. In North Africa, the war continues. The leading German tank commander, Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, was supremely effective in North African tank warfare, in leading the German army to dominance over the British. However, they were not able to completely force the British from North Africa. The British had their own sort of noteworthy tank commander, General Bernard Montgomery, and the Americans, after they enter the war, not only against the Japanese, but against fascist forces in Europe, they arrive too in the western parts of North Africa, in Morocco. And what ultimately happens is, despite the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, being sort of the genius tank commander of German military history, and being especially effective in tank warfare in the desert, with the British moving from Egypt under General Montgomery, and the Americans coming from the west in Morocco. They're able to squeeze the German forces sort of between them. The Americans and the British ultimately meet up in Tunisia and force the Germans and the Italians to retreat from North Africa. The success in the North African campaign and the fact that these armies are able to meet up in Tunisia, which is right across the Mediterranean from Italy, provides a launching point for the invasion first of the island of Sicily and then ultimately an attack on the Italian mainland. The Italian campaign takes years. It's 1942 and 1943 before the Allies are able to advance slowly up the Italian peninsula, facing strong resistance from Italian and German troops along the way. The Italians weren't able to hold the peninsula by themselves. The Germans had to divert resources from their fight against the Soviet Union to help their Italian allies slow the Allied advance. Ultimately, though, after years of fighting, the Italian and German combined forces give way, and by 1944, the Allies are securely in control of the Italian peninsula and ready to make an assault on Europe. This was great news for the Soviets, who had been begging for years for their Western allies of Britain and the United States to open another front in Europe, a Western front somewhere in Europe, to take some pressure off of the Soviet defenders of Moscow and Stalingrad. We should check in also for major turning points in the Pacific War. Japan by 1941 had extended their control not just to China, but throughout Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, the islands of the Philippines. At every point they faced strong local resistance. The people of Southeast Asia did not just roll over and let the Japanese take what they wanted. So it was slow going and tough going for the Japanese to expand their empire in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia. But they did, and by 1941 they controlled much of Southeast Asia. However, the sea dominance that they enjoyed after Pearl Harbor began to slip away. The American Pacific Fleet had not lost a single carrier at Pearl Harbor and was able to refloat and repair several of the battleships that had been sunk there. So as the American fleet, Pacific Fleet, comes back into play, we start seeing some naval victories for the Allies. A sea battle at the Coral Sea basically stops any chance that the Japanese could invade Australia. And an important battle at Midway, which is not so much a sea battle but an air battle, fought with dive bombers and torpedo bombers, damages the Japanese fleet, sinks multiple aircraft carriers, and basically eliminates the Japanese superiority in the Pacific. A combined victory at Guadalcanal, land, air, and sea, is basically gives the Allies their first sort of strong island toehold in the South Pacific, and it enables the Allies to start a campaign of island hopping, where they move one island at a time. With each island they're able to recapture, they can have fueling stations and airfields and supply depots, and then they move on to the next island. On land, you've got General Douglas MacArthur leading the Army forces, fighting these land battles, going ashore and trying to take these islands. And at sea, you've got Admiral Chester Nimitz of the American Navy. These are the two guys, one Navy commander, one Army commander, that work this combined land, air, and sea campaign of island hopping in the Pacific. Aircraft in this scenario becomes completely decisive on both sides. The American aircraft carriers, the fact that the Japanese were unable to destroy any American carriers at Pearl, and that the Americans were able to destroy several Japanese carriers at Midway, gives the American military the upper hand in the air war. However, the Japanese implement the tactic of kamikaze suicide bombers, small single-pilot planes with one large munition who basically used the aircraft to target American warships and literally fly the plane and the bomb right into their target. At this point, we've seen turning points in Europe, in North Africa, and in the Pacific. And by this point, 1941, 1942, 1943, the war has begun to shift in the favor of the Allies.